Thank you, Ellen. It's nice to see so many people here. I was afraid I'd come and be only native friendship people like Ruth and Steve, and that'd be like preaching to the choir. But Steve is really a newcomer. He's not really a native of Friendship Community. Joyce and Ruth and me, this has been home ever since we've been in this world. We grew up in this community, and Ruth wasn't too far behind me in age, or vice versa, or something like that. But you have moved into the greatest community in the world. This community is not just good now, it has been good since the beginning of time. Really and truly. This has been an outstanding community. And I grew up here, and my first two children were born right across the road here. We lived there then, and I've not lived out of sight of Friendship in my entire life, college and service, but other than that, I've been here and seen all the changes. And my earliest historical things that I'm proud of was living next door to me until I was 12 years old, or in the community, was Aunt Joyce Kimsey, who was Joyce Holmes and Ruth's grandmother. She learned to spin with a spinning wheel during the Civil War. And me being a young child, I had all the questions in the world about what this place was like when the Yankees came through, when there was still some Indians left, what went on here. She lived in this community. She was born just in front of where I live now. Every time John and I sit out and watch the sun go down, we think about Aunt Joyce lived down under the lake right in front of us, and then she moved across the river. Now the river side of town is over on the side on the other side of the bridge, but the river divided the communities. That Friendship Community stopped at the river, stopped at the North Carolina line, and stopped not going this way, but going down the old roadway. Paul Ledford's was sort of between the Withrow and Friendship. And the original families, and I may have missed somebody who was here temporarily or something, was the Kimses. And I don't know who was the very first, but the Kimses were here early on. Kimses, Gregory's being the one. Gregory's built the house that my mother has, the house down the road here, Denton Strait, sometime in late 1870 or 1880. Was a Gregory who built that house, was early on. Then the Suttons, who are still here. I was talking to Henry this week, and he said, yeah, he lives in the same land as his great-grandfather lived on. His great-grandfather was the best surveyor Towns County ever had. If you ever find a plat in checking your old records that was made by Bob Sutton, it'll be just as accurate today as it was back then. It's amazing. The man used chains and lengths for his descriptions, not feet and inches. But it's amazing how accurate his surveys were. And then Henry's father did surveying when TVA came and put in the corner markers on most of the land lots in the county. There's one right here behind Manships, permanent concrete markers, and he spent 2 or 3 years. The Suttons, Phillipses, which are still with us, the Dentons, the Martins, the Rogerses, the Gribbles, the Russells. We were just talking about the Russells. And the Penlands, the Woodrings, Cunninghams, Ellises, Woods, Redfords, and McConnells. And we all went to Friendship Church. Friendship Church was there. My daddy came down here in 1907. Daddy was not really born down here, so Grandpa didn't move down here. And we lived where the music hall is before the lake was built. So that was home to us. And Ruth lived approximately where she lives now, and was our closest neighbor coming out this way. And one of the few places it still looks like it used to. If you were at the music hall and looked across at Ruth's house, it's just almost like it was. The same timber line, the same open field. is one of the few places I can stand and remember the change hasn't affected that little pasture right there. So we started out in of course, the Depression years when CC camps and WPA and things like that were just getting initiated. But I remember most of the things that Aunt Jose would tell me. And the Yankees came through and came up the old road. And the old road from Hayesville or from Young Harris came up by Friendship Church, between Friendship Church and Steve's house. Went down by Donnie Payne's cabinet shop. Straight down, crossed over Hog Creek, which you forded with no bridge there. You drove in and out of Hog Creek. Then you went over the hill by what's Cemetery Island, if you're out in the boat and you see the little island out there, and somebody said, what is that? And they call it Cemetery Island. And that was the Birch Cemetery where the majority of the people here were buried prior to the lake. And when the lake came, the families they could contact, they agreed to move the graves and move them over in the Sunnyside Road. And then after you went by a cemetery, you went down a hill and across an iron bridge, big iron steel bridge across the Hiwassee River. Then came up through Hiwassee Estate, backside of Taylor Ridge, up to the present highway that goes up by the Barongs and straight into town. So when you left town coming out, you swung around down this bridge and back up and across to get to Hayesville or to get to Young Harris or whatever. And then in the 30s, we changed that road and built a new highway, a new bridge, and it was just west of the present bridge. At the recreation park, the road came from Hiwassee, where the Cochran's Funeral Home is. That street there is the original road from Hiwassee to Hayesville and Young Harris. And from there, it went almost a straight line to where the recreation building, the small recreation building is at the fairgrounds. Crossed the present road, went down through the ball field, and came out again over at Phillips, where the circle is going around toward Headley Cove. That circle there was Phillips Corner. And if you stand there and look straight toward town, you can see it just almost a straight line back to, and then at the Phillips you went left to go to Young Harris. So you were down here going that way to Young Harris, but you continue straight to Hayesville. It was only about 6 miles from here to Hayesville that way. You didn't go all the way out to Young Harris and then back down to Hayesville. It was just another straight shot down the old roadway into Hayesville. So how did we grow up? We grew up, at the time, I thought like everybody else. We didn't have running water, and we didn't have telephones, and we didn't have electricity. We didn't have inside bathrooms. We didn't have electric heat or gas heat or oil heat, and maybe only 1 or 2 coal heated furnaces in the county, or stoves in the county. Primarily it was just 100% fireplaces. And when you think about it, that's all my grandfather and my great-grandfather had, was a fireplace and a log house, and the same type of thing we had. So the generation from my age back to our grandparents was not anywhere near the difference that's between us now and our children, and much less our grandchildren. Our children don't realize how much change there was wherever we were. But we had, in the 30s, no electricity. We had some cars in the community. There was probably 3 cars, 4 cars, I think of, in the whole community. Everybody was farmers, and in addition to being farmers, we had bankers, we had school teachers, we had revenue officers, timber people, that type of thing. As my daddy always said, son, as long as you've got a good job, you can probably afford to farm. So, but that's what we all did. We all farmed, and the two Suttons were school teachers. And talking about the banker, I was telling somebody about Heather Cove and that property there being owned by the Russells, a very prosperous farmer. He was so prosperous that he owned a third of the Bank of Hiawassee, and he was vice president of the Bank of Hiawassee. And when they sold it in 1945, the stock, the building, the equipment, everything brought $15,000. And Mr. Russell was rich. He had 1/3 of $15,000 for his years of owning the Bank of Hiawassee. So he was a far more successful farmer, I think, than he was a banker. But they had a lot of land down there, and his father, of course, had even more. And then the next family down that's totally underwater is the Penlands, which were in-laws to the Russells. And that was probably the most beautiful place in the community because it was up on a bluff. Somebody's saying it was some steep hills. Yes, it was. It was some places that went almost straight up and down, and they lived in one of these type places, only it was rolling down enough to where you could walk up and down it. But when you got down to the river, it was just big, flat, level pasture with trees scattered, big river flowing by. It was a great place to have a picnic. There was a spring back up there, and it was some of the places that we sort of went to and having a picnic or something was go down to the Penland property, and that was the last property until you got into North Carolina going down that way. But the big thing that we did naturally was go to church, and the church was very, very active then, and we had one family which were Russellites, right, Ruth? Is that what they called themselves back at that time? Which was really what today is Jehovah's Witness. And that was strange. I mean, even Catholics, of course, we'd never heard of. We'd heard of a few Methodists. If you went to a certain community, you could find a few Methodists. But other than that, God intended for everybody to be Baptist. The biggest event in the county was always the annual singing convention, which was held at the schoolhouse. And that brought out more people that from other communities than anything we did. So you got ready for that months in advance and planned exactly what dish you were going to cook, what you were going to take. And there's too many things to tell. If somebody has a question, I'd love a question as to what you are curious about our community here. What have you heard? What have you seen? What have you observed? Or what do you wonder about? And see if I can help answer your question, because I can go on and on about Daddy driving turkeys to Toccoa, Georgia for sale. I couldn't imagine you can drive a herd of turkeys anywhere, but you leave here for a herd of turkeys and you take them to Toccoa and sell them. That's a pretty good trip even today. And somebody else mentioned the cattle laws. Yeah, you fenced in your garden because the cattle ran wild. When you went up the road, you had to watch out for the cattle because they had the right of way. It was way up into the 40s and 50s before we had stock laws that required you to put your cattle inside a pasture, and took them to the mountains even after this road here was built, after the lake. I remember Mr. Garrett up here driving his cattle right down the highway here and out to Eagle Mountain, Left Mountain in the fall. And also I can remember Daddy and Mother renting a milk cow. You rented a milk cow. We couldn't afford to buy a milk cow, so we rented a milk cow. And when the horses, you got through plowing them in the summer, if you didn't have enough pasture land, you would go rent pasture. We'd take ours over to Charlie Corns and Young Harris. Just as soon as we get corn laid by, son, the grass is getting low and the cattle need it. We've got to get all our plowing done so we can take these horses and turn them into another pasture. And things like that are interesting. And the thing that...
Where was the nearest grist mill?
The nearest grist mill. Well, let's see. We had one in front of where Hog Creek Methodist Church is. There was one right there just below the bridge. That was Brad Wood, had one there. There was one out in Bell Creek, Hog Creek. All the creeks had corn mills where we would go. And the interesting thing about that is I would load up corn here when we were living here in Highway after this was made, and go to a mill up in Father Creek, Mr. Brown. And it was about a 2.5 hour trip, horse pulling the wagon. And I'd have to stop all the steep hills and let the horse rest. And finally I'd get there and it'd be 10:30 in the morning. And he'd start grinding my meal. And it ground so slow it took all day. But it would come lunchtime and he'd say, "Son, I'll be back after a while. Gotta go up to the house and eat." Okay, that was all right. But then one Saturday I decided I'd go out in Bell Creek to Mr. Gibson's mill. Try that out. It's a little bit closer, but I hadn't used him before. So we go out there, and about the same time of day, and it comes time to eat. He said, "Son, let's go up to the house and see what the old lady's got cooked." I never did go back to Father Creek anymore. Started taking my business to Bell Creek.
Can you talk about the creation of the dam, the disruption of families, and the whole thing as to what that was and its
yes.
in the community?
Yes, the dam. I built my first brooder for brooding little baby chicks out of 2x12s. I stole out the bridge where they were building the new bridge. Took my little wagon, I go over and I find these nice big long 2x12s, and out of aggressive farmer, I'd gotten this little blueprint for making a brooder, so that made me a brooder. The time of the TVA coming, as you would imagine, it totally changed the complexion of the entire county. It created consolidation of schools. As Hog Creek had their school, we had our school. We didn't know the children in the community because we were all in small schools, and a lot of them were one room. Some of them were 2 room. I happened to go to one, and where the tax office is in Hiawassee, it had 4 rooms. That was the biggest elementary school in the county. But when the lake came, we started separating families, neighborhoods, people moving away. They had always farmed. They farmed the bottom land. Upland was not worth farming. You couldn't make a living on upland. So the farmer at that day and time thought he had to have bottom land. So when the TVA ran their measurements and put stakes up how high it was going to come, even farmers who was left with a little bit of land felt like, we can't make a living here, we've got to find another place to go. Some of them relocated in the county, a lot of them moved away. But also, it was the first time we had seen any real money in the county. When the people started moving in here to work on the dams, it created an income. And as in anything create income, it created activities. Even in the 30s, early 30s, we had 5 hotels in Hiawassee. I mean, they were only 3 stories and 6 or 8 rooms each, but at least we had a tourist business in the 30s. So of course those places all filled up from people moving in to work in the dam. There was people who just traveled with TVA dams from one dam to the next dam to the next dam. Also, it created a little bit of a honky-tonk atmosphere. We had between the fairgrounds and Hiawassee, if you walked up the old road, we had 5 beer joints, none of which were legal, but they served beer and they served white liquor and they served red liquor. And the difference was they put food coloring in the red liquor And we'd get the liquor bottles, little flat liquor bottles, you know, that people throw out along the road, and we could take them back to these beer joints, and they'd give us a nickel apiece for 'em. So on the way home from school, we'd walk along down the road, pick these up, look and see that none of the adults was watching us, and we'd dart inside one of the beer joints and sell them some bottles so they could refill their red liquor. It brought more money than the white liquor. This was not a whiskey making community, but we had some people here who all they'd ever done in their life was sell it. They were entrepreneurs, and they did the selling of it, but it was not a community. You would have to get to some of the other communities. But these places flourished when the TBA people came. And then we had dance halls. Naturally, if you got to have alcohol and you got a whole bunch of single men, you got to have a dance hall. So we had some dance halls, which was sort of old. Had one like in the middle of Hiawassee, and literally on Saturday afternoon you couldn't drive through town because somebody'd be out in the street fighting. So you had to slow down when you got up in front of DeLong's. Somebody'd be out there fighting.
What time span are you talking about? When did you first hear about the lake? When did they first start building on it, and when did they finish?
We started hearing about the lake about 39. Prior to that, we had a man who everybody called a fool, and he was going to build a dam, and he was going to make electricity, and he was going to furnish us with electricity. So this was probably in 35 and 36, Mr. Tinker. And, everybody knew he was a fool and eccentric and crazy. So when the TVA actually started thinking about it, it was sort of like, well, no, that's just some more of Tinker's idea. So we didn't really take it serious until they came in and started actually moving the dirt. And by that time, we had electricity. About 37, we got our first electricity, which just came primarily along the main highway. It was up in the 70s before the whole county was covered in electricity. But here, some of us along the road got electricity then. So we had electricity, and the dam was not built for the purpose of generating electricity. It was going to be a reservoir to flood control. So we didn't expect that light bills, electric bills would go down. We had a minimum bill of $1 then, didn't make any difference what you used. And most people got by on the dollar. But some people who had heavy use, the bill would be $2. And I can remember taking lots and lots of $2.06 payments for electric bills. But when they actually started to work was when we decided that they were really going to build the dam. And then we'd heard stories from Murphy when they built Hiawassee Dam and Hiawassee Lake relative to what happened in the community, everybody moving out. Part of the family would stay, part of the family would move. So we lost a lot of our good families and a lot of our good farmers because it took primarily the farmland. Anything above Hiawassee was smaller acreage on the bottoms. As you go up through Hiawassee River, you can see an example of what would have existed down here on the river, big flat fields along the river. So there was a lot of activity when they were building new roads. You couldn't imagine what it was going to look like. They would build a part of this road, and they'd be building the other end of the road, and they'd be clearing here and then maybe 2 miles away. They didn't start the dam and cut all the timber, but they did cut all the timber. They didn't leave out in the lake, they didn't leave any timber standing. They cleared it all, piled it up with horses, burned it, and all the timber was cut. They just pulled it up with horses in big piles and then burned. So all day and all night there was fires burning because they had lots and lots of crews, and they contracted to the local people. If you had a team of horses, you could get a job clearing land, all with crosscut saw, no power saws at that time. Didn't use a bulldozer to push them up. You cut them down with 2 men pulling a crosscut saw, dragging them up in piles. So it created a lot of employment, and it took a lot of ants to build the dam, not just the ones operating the machinery down there, but the ones who were clearing the land. Then the next thing was people who had a fairly decent house wanted to move the house. So crew from outside came in and started selling the idea, well, we can move this house, we can pull it from here, because when they bought our land, they left us houses. If we didn't tear them down or move them, they would tear them down and burn them, but if you wanted to keep your house or move your house, so a lot of houses were moved. One was Joyce's parents, just came down the hill. They were on the top of the hill where the house is now by Donnie Payne's cabinet shop, and the next house there was sitting on top of that hill. So I just rolled it down the hill, relocated it just a few feet below where it was. Others moved on long distance. One moved from Woods Grove, we're talking about today, all the way on Hiwassee River near the foot of the mountain. And they put big trucks up under them and go half a mile a day. And there was a lot of moving there, a lot of moving. One of the things that I did was people had old wagons, and when they got a new wagon, they had these old ones. I'd go around and buy the old wagons, put them all together, and then sell them to these people who were moving and needed a better wagon to move in. So I had a good little business going, rebuilding wagons, buying pieces, getting enough pieces, putting one together, and probably get $25 for a good wagon. But they were still moving in wagons. The point is, they were didn't everybody move in trucks. We moved in a wagon. When we moved from fairgrounds over the highway here, naturally it was put it in the wagon, load it in, load it out. Yes, sir.
What's the story on Bell Mountain and how come the mining that caused that cleft up there? When was that and why?
That was late 50s. Money Mining in Murphy had some mines, quartz mines, and crushed it for stone and so forth. So he came up and got the contract to get stone off the mountain, and they just blasted the top off. Where it got its Bell Mountain, if you've seen one of the pictures of this highway showing Bell Mountain that really looks like a bell, they took that whole top of the bell off and made that V in it. So it was really shaped from here looking up. It came up and like a bell, where now it comes up and goes down. The bell
Why
part.
did it stop? Asked to stop, or did it just
No. That was going to be big income. You know, the county was glad to have them. The noise wasn't anybody lived up there. You couldn't hear much, and they'd blast every once in a while, and you could look it up and see the dust fly. What stopped them was it wasn't practical to get it out. They couldn't make any money on it. But as far as any environmental requirements, no. They were glad to see them come. It was going to bring income. It was like so many things that we did that were probably wrong. If it brought $1, everybody was all for it, because the dollars were so limited that anything that proposed to bring dollars, the lake, we all was sorry to see our neighbors move and see the land ruined and all this. But Daddy said, son, may be the best thing that ever happened to us, and probably is. I think we're a lot better off with the lake. But it was like you run me off my land where my great-grandparents lived, paid us nothing for it. I mean, nothing. We had 60 acres, 2 houses, and a new barn, and we got $3,600. And the price they paid was, but relative to someplace else, you could go down below the mountain and probably buy land for $5 or $6 an acre, but you couldn't grow anything on it. So the savvy farmer, when you got on the other side of the mountain, the land was so poor, you couldn't farm it. Up here, you had the bottom land. So it really changed. The your friends moved away. That left you sad. But the economic base was stronger during that period of time. And then immediately when it was completed and the water was started up in 1941, and they started filling it up with water, the war started, which brought more money per se, because you had most of the boys going in service still had dependent parents, and you had money coming back, even though it was $10 or $15 a month.
When they were farming the bottomland, did they grow enough crops that they could export it out of this valley, or was it?
Oh yeah. You hauled it someplace and sold a lot of it. Chestnuts is an example. Before the chestnut blight, there were several families who would go out in the mountains and gather wagon roads of chestnuts and take and sell. Corn, wheat, rye, you could sell outside. And usually your hogs, you sold them, and your chickens, you take them to the store and trade your chickens and your eggs, and even trade your hogs if that's what you wanted to do. But we raised generally more than we ate. Yes, we could feed the livestock, we could feed the family, and usually have a little bit left for sale. And some was as smart as Ruth's mama and sold flowers. Made some good money selling flowers. But we sold sweet potatoes. That was something we could grow well. Syrup. Everybody had a field of cane and a syrup mill in the community, and sold syrup, and that brought good money. Other people had bees, made honey. Other people just went through the mountains finding bee trees and getting the bees, honey, and selling it. So yes, there was a surplus of food, because the bottomland really grew good products. So we would primarily raise wheat, rye, and corn. Very little pasture land. No cattle farming per se in the 30s. You just had the milk cow that you had to depend on for milk, but you didn't have any dairy herds or anything of that nature, or beef cattle, either one. Yes, sir.
I got a couple of them. The first one, in the big old white schoolhouse that was up there in town. What year did they put electricity in there?
Electricity went into the big white school building about the year it was built. It was built in 36 and 37. And by that time we had electricity and had a little drop cord hanging down in the auditorium. Yeah. And that school was paid for by the county. There wasn't any state funds in that. This present schoolhouse is the first high school in this county that was paid for with any state funds. The original high school was owned by the Baptist Church. It was Hiawassee Academy. Then it became Hiawassee High School. Then they donated to the county. It became Towns County High School. And in 37, when they built the new white building, the county had enough money to pay for it. And in the 70s, when we built the present comprehensive school, the first time we used any state money. And Towns County's been pretty good at that kind of thing.
Well, did the electricity get generated here locally, or did it come in on the wire?
It came in on the wire.
Came in.
Yeah.
The other question is, way back in like 1940 and 41, when Uncle Sam wiggled his finger and says, "Hey, young man, come work for me in the Army," how did these young men get out of here? They walked.
No, we had a bus. That's an interesting thing. In the 30s and 40s, we had 5 buses a day coming through Hiawassee. Ruth could get in the bus in the morning, ride to Young Harris, go to college, ride it back home. You could get in the bus in the morning, ride to Gainesville, go shopping, get in the bus and come back home. You leave here at 10 o'clock in the morning, ride the bus to Atlanta, catch it at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and you've ridden that many a time up through LJ and Blue Ridge, and get up here at 10 o'clock and drop her off up here at Friendship. And this was in the 30s and 40s. We actually had bus service. Now I asked Daddy and Mother that same question about World War I. And I said, where did the boys, how did they get out of here? And they said, well, a bus would come in front of the bank and the drugstore, which is where Charles Corey's office was the drugstore. And that was the bus terminal. So you got your notice from the Selective Service to meet at the bus station on a certain morning, and a bus would come up from Atlanta or Gainesville or someplace, just especially to pick them up. And that took everybody in the community. I mean, when we started going into service, we lost several boys right here in this community, but countywide we lost several, and they were all gone. My mother had 6 brothers in service at one time, plus my brother, and there was not a family in the county that missed the draft unless they were like certain Kimsey we knew of didn't have any boys.
And one that had one they wouldn't take.
You had a brother. You had a brother. Joyce didn't. Or either they had a disability that somebody couldn't take them.
Deferring him on the county, he was in the timber business.
Oh, okay. And a lot of people.
Be ready to go and
A lot of people went to work in the Alabama plant in Marietta, went to the rubber mills in Ohio and various places. And mostly they were older and had children, and it was easier to get exempt. But it really cleaned the county out. And one, the Cunningham family I mentioned, Harold had gone into service just about 40, 41, been overseas, came home after the lake was built, got in town, stopped in Hiawassee and said, how in the hell did I get home? He'd grown up here, but the roads has changed so much. You couldn't get there from here in his mind. Yes, sir.
Your buses that ran to Gainesville and Atlanta, paved roads or dirt roads?
We had a paved road from Hiawassee to Blairsville, and from Hiawassee to Hayesville, and Hiawassee to Clayton. Unicoi was not paved. Going across Unicoi was not paved up until the late 40s. And we didn't have any paved local roads, but we did have a road that came from Clayton across the mountain, but it was paved in about 1950, 51, when it was paved. But in the 30s, you had the road from about Macedonia through town to Young Harris and on out to Blairsville. And then in 34 or 35, they built the paved road from the Phillips corner down to the North Carolina line. And it was up in the 50s and 60s before we paved any rural roads. I mean, you shut school down because you couldn't get there in a school bus or anything. But in the 30s and 40s, we didn't have school buses anyway. So it wasn't a problem then, but in the late 40s and 50s, the roads became a problem because they started trying to run school buses on.
well, did you think to tell them that the Phillips house out here, the old house sitting right over there was moved? It was sitting in that Y over there where you go down to the lake and go towards, it was sitting right there, back over. And that, where the flowers bloom back in there. They moved that.
Moved that house just up the hill
The
there.
house on the other side was moved too,
Yeah. Ralph's house.
somewhere else there.
Medical care, hospital, when,
We had the hospital in Franklin, which was the most used hospital. Franklin, Gainesville, and Murphy. We had local doctors, such as they were in Hayesville, Young Harris, and Hiawassee. We had 2 doctors in Hiawassee, probably 2 in Hayesville, 1 in Young Harris, that just did plain, brought the doctor's kit and whatever they had in it was all they had. Didn't do any surgery or anything of that nature. But if you had to have appendix out or emergency of any sort, you even went to Franklin, which was on the crookedest, most narrow 2-lane road anybody ever traveled on, was from Hayesville to Franklin. And could go to Murphy, and Murphy was sort of questionable. Some people didn't like the doctors in Murphy, so it was generally when you went from here, you went to Franklin.
When they started to fill up the lake, once they put the plug in, how long did it take to make a lake?
They didn't come on up to full level. It came up very slow in the fall of 40 and the fall of 41. And in 42 and 43, it still hadn't been completely full because they did like they do now. They they pull it down. It has been full several times, and it was very common through the 40s and 50s for the lake go down to where there wasn't any water under the bridge. You think the water's low now. Lots of years, when you cross the bridge, you look right down and see. And from the ball field over to Phillips's, we used that for several years. Just continued to drive across that. It didn't get up high enough in the summer to even cover off that section around the fairgrounds.
But what was the reason for that? I mean, did they just need the water for downstream or something?
Yeah, just like they do now. That's the reason they lower it now. It's a flood control. Put water in the Tennessee River for barge traffic and that sort of thing. That's the purpose of it. It's not a generating. It has a generator down there, but they say it would probably make enough to run part of the city of Hiawassee, all the power it would produce. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering about the CCC projects. Were there any within Towns County? I know they were over at Bogle.
Oh yeah, we had CC camps in the county, and we had the WPA, and the road up to Ball Mountain, things like that. They worked on, and one I remember Silas Baker was in charge of was digging up all the gooseberries. Went all over the county digging up gooseberries, and I never knew what was wrong.
They had a blight of some sort.
Anyway, and I always wondered what was wrong with the poor old gooseberries, but they had a crew out digging up gooseberries all over the county.
Must have carried some.
But we had CC camps, and a lot of our boys went into CC camps away from here, over at Suches or over in Rayburn County or over in the edge of North Carolina, and we had a lot of people in CC camps.
Did they do any reforestation? The CCC boys, like over at Unicoi, or
No, primarily it was already in forest.
what is it?
Primarily everything that wasn't being farmed, you didn't cut down, you didn't clear cut timber. If you're cutting timber, and we had a lot of timber business, a lot of big companies, Riddle Lumber Company, May Lumber Company, Champion Paper and Fiber, and something John always tells people he does, that some of you may know what it is, and get out tan bark. Anybody ever get out tan bark or acid wood? I mean, sure, you're going out and caught spring lizards, but did you ever have a profession of getting out acid wood? You'd ask, oh boy, well, what are you doing? Oh, I'm getting out a little acid wood. You run in another, what are you doing? I'm getting out some tan bark. Now you know what pulpwood is, but it's interesting to me to go back to tan bark and acid wood. Yes, ma'am.
The hotels and the building that had several stores in it, and the beer halls and the dance halls, when did they all go? I mean, was it all at once, or all the commerce?
Why?
That was down, yeah. What happened? Depression.
One burned.
Some of the hotels burned, and Steve's sister-in-law's married family owned the last one up there. Homer Nixon owned one, but primarily the Need Farm dried up. After people came back home from service, they didn't stay, and you didn't have the drummer or the person that came around selling. Those were probably 4 or 5 people a week that came and spent the night, who was taking orders for hats, suits, shirts, pants, Watkins, liniment, whatever it may be. He always had that group. And then the high school was a boarding school, so a lot of them catered to the boarding student, who they came and, as they would say, patched and stayed in the hotel and went to high school. So the demand for them slowed down, and by the time the war came, after the war and when the lake came, we started building the tourist cabins. The ones Thurman, Caldwell, and the camps down through here. The Robinson camp right here was built in the 50s. So we started building the fishing camps because with it was good fishing. Being a freshwater lake and a fresh lake, there was a lot of food in there. So we were real popular in the 42, 43, 44 along all through there. I don't know up into the 70 and 80 so our first thing that we placed the hotels was the tourist camps out along the lake and not anybody staying in the hotels.
How many people would you guess were moved out when the lake was built? Like 10 families or like hundreds or like how many?
The whole county?
Yeah.
I would say at least 100, wouldn't you? At least 100 families left. Yeah. Or were dislocated because you stretch from the North Carolina line all the way up to Hightower and up Fowler Creek, and a lot of families along the way. And not that we were that heavily populated, but there was a lot of families involved. But since we're sort of in the center here, it really hurt this community because, as you can see, we're surrounded by water, and all that land out here is underwater, is where everybody was making a living. That's the Kimsey's families and us and everybody primarily farmed that.
One, did the Yankees come through here?
Yes, Aunt Joe said the Yankees came through here.
Where were they going?
They were going over to South Carolina. And when you read the Civil War, it seems like we sent the word out that us all meet at Joe Blow's pool or something. We'll have a little war next week. They didn't travel in armies. They came back home in between. They'd come home, put in the crops. You read the letters, and they would come put in crops, and then they'd go fight a while, and then they'd come back home.
Two, where do you think the Indian village was?
The Indian village is in front of west side of Tater Ridge, down near where the old Birch Bridge was. And during Aunt Joseph's lifetime, they came back and had powwows and had events back in their old home ground, even after they had left and gone even to Tahlequah. My grandparents went to Tahlequah, lived and died in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. But the ones who stayed in Cherokee or stayed out here still came back here once a year and had a meeting. And she would say that the ones who came first and made the arrangements, like the president and so forth, they associated with the white folks in the community. But once the real Indians started coming in, they didn't want any white folks down around where they were. They didn't get out and visit any. They didn't harm anybody. They didn't bother anything. But the leaders come a week or so in advance and start making preparation. And that was at the time of the Civil War.
When the lake is down real low, can you see anything that makes you know that the Indian village was there? Has anybody ever looked for artifacts and things like that?
Oh yeah. John just found some recently right in front of the house. That's where it is, right in front of our house is where it was. But you find a lot of Indian artifacts throughout the county. You find places where there's piles of arrowheads and shavings off of arrowheads, or obviously this was a place that worked, and you find a bunch of chips. And over in the fairground, I had big 5-gallon jugs full of arrowheads that I picked up right out of the fields over there. It was just, anytime it rained after you plowed the field, you just walk along and pick up handfuls of good, perfect arrowheads.
Are those arrowheads at the bank?
Some of them are, some of them down in my office. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, are the ones in the bank local?
Most of them are. Most of them are. Mm-hmm. There's some, as you know, exceptional ones in there that were trade items and so forth. But basically, the ones in the bank are native to here. Yeah.
Was there ever any Indian activity down around Macedonia Church, around that bridge down there?
Oh yeah. I mean, the Indians populated the place.
Yeah.
You know, they were here before us, so they were throughout this whole valley, over in Bricetown. And
do we have any idea how many?
I don't. No.
When they moved out?
In the 1830s. 1830s, Trail of Tears. Trail of Tears started here, and there was a stockade at Hayesville behind Jackie Jones Chrysler Plymouth that may still be standing, where they rounded them up and put them in stockades until they started the Trail of Tears. So the Trail of Tears goes from down in White County through here to Lonaga and on out through Calhoun, all that section. And the Cherokee, North Carolina, they were sort of moved there like they were moved to Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Most of ours here went on the Trail of Tears to Tahlequah, Oklahoma, where they gave them a reservation. And that's where my great-grandparents went, was to Tahlequah. And all mother's first cousins and everything lived and died in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, because my great-grandmother was an Indian. Yeah.
I know you have your pulse on what's going on in the community, and I wonder what you see or foresee in the future, in the next 10 years in this county.
What do I foresee? Not a whole lot different from what we're doing now.
Growth and more growth?
Growth and more growth, and it's something you don't stop. I mean, think about if we put a gate at Unicoi years ago, a lot of you'd miss a great place to live.
No, you have to put it after we moved in.
And that's the problem we have with the new people who come because they like what's here, and then they get here, they want to close the gate and keep anybody else from coming. Most of you are real nice people and have been a great asset to the community. And you're not looked down on the way we joke about it. That you're not, you're all,
Just how does it
newcomers have always been welcome. Newcomers have been welcome in Towns County as far back as anybody can remember, because we're a warm, friendly one, and we like our neighbors who are newcomers. And we don't know about your neighbors because we don't know them, but we know we have good neighbors who are newcomers. And that's sort of the way it was. You didn't like certain people when we were all natives, but there was some little quirk where the people living next door to them didn't have any problems with them. But I don't see anything other than just more growth, more people, especially as more people move into Atlanta from up north, who are used to going to the mountains in the summertime, as New York City and that type of thing. More of them come to Atlanta are going to find us faster than you Atlanta people found us. Of course, we were the first real estate people in the county, first insurance agents in the county, first real estate people. But anyway, in the 40s and 50s, we only advertised in the Miami Herald. We didn't advertise in the Atlanta newspaper because nobody wanted to come up here. We were podunk to the people in Atlanta. They were sophisticated, they were high-class people, and they didn't have nothing to do with us hillbillies up here. But the Floridians, when he came up, he liked us. He enjoyed coming up here. So in the first years of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the majority of our people came right out of Florida, and most of them at that time were native. They were not Yankee transplants. They were, native Floridians, police officers, firemen, stuff like that. And that was our biggest draw. In fact, it was a period of time there when we were wondering if we'd ever attract any Georgians up here. It was just, people buying land were from Florida. So I think we will attract more out of Atlanta, not necessarily that there'll be native Georgians, but I think there'll be more people coming looking for a better, more expensive home, more expensive land, that type of thing. And county government, like it or not like it, it's got good and it's got bad, but it's slow to change. We've never had any real bad administrations through the years. We have been fortunate to have pretty honest people in most positions, but it's a slow thing to change because who I call the creek bank people, they see things one way. Me being in the fair 50 years, always promoting tourism, and my buddies and best friends are saying we don't need those tourists. They don't spend any money They don't bring anything, you know, and you had to put up with that. So you go to the Lions Club meeting and keep working on the fair and keep trying to get people up here, but your best friends opposed what you were doing. As you know, when you talk to a native in Towns County, most of them don't have much respect for the fair. Probably if it hadn't been for the fair, all these outlaws wouldn't have been here, that type of thing. So Creek Bank, or native thinking among a certain group, which is the vocal group, makes political change slow. And sometimes that's good. You know, sometimes we'd like to see them change it. We'd like to see a lot fewer trees cut down and so forth and so on. But those trees do grow back. There's things, Bell Mountain's not going to grow back. That's the sad part of the things. So I look across the road, think about stuff like that I really don't like to see. But it will eventually change. Yeah, baby.
Going back to the 30s and 40s, and you were talking about the bus, that's the only way people got it. Did anybody ever go over the mountain in a horse and wagon, and how long would it take them to get from Hiawassee to Helen?
Oh, you always went over that. That's the only way our parents and grandparents had of traveling.
How long did it take them?
To Helen, you can make Helen probably by mid-afternoon if you left here fairly early in the morning. And even when you had cars, you'd stop up on top of Unicoi and cut a bush and tie on the back of the car to keep from wearing the brakes out going down the other side of the mountain. And at the foot of the mountain, there was a steep place, and there were just piles and piles of trees rolled off over the side of the mountain. And up in the gap, way up, I mean, you have to walk a pretty good while to get up to where you find a tree big enough that you could cut, drag down, tie to the back of your car, and head down. And if you, on the present road now, at Unicoi, and you get to the top of the mountain, just over the top, you look to your right and see that real deep valley right there. The road went right down the middle of that. You didn't wind down the mountain like you do now. When you left the top of Unicoi, you went right down and down along the river and came out down in Helen. So it was a steep pull. And
You went across Trey.
or you went across Trey Mountain, yeah, which is to the left.
How about when you came back up? When you came back up, was it just a real...
You just put that old T-model in low gear and hoped it made it. And you might burn out the bands, you know, it was driven by bands, but it was a steep pull, but there wasn't too many cars going at that time. It was primarily just wagons, and you pull a wagon 100 feet and rest, pull some more and rest, and then, you know, you had to tie something behind the wagon too, because you didn't have the best brakes in the world in the wagon. You could lock it up going downhill, and it'd slide faster than the horses could get out of the way. But all your stuff going to market and all your produce, or not produce, didn't have produce, but all the salt, sugar, and stuff like that was being brought in had to be brought in by horse and wagon.
It seems like when they were felling all those trees and everything for the lake, there must have been an awful lot of injuries. Were there? Or,
Oh no.
No?
No. These people worked in timber all their life.
Yeah.
They had been, very seldom you ever heard of a tree falling on anybody then. They were experienced timber people. They grew up as sort of like our bootlegger we had at the fair. They said, "Mr. King, have you made liquor all your life?" And he says, "No, ma'am. I was 5 years old before my daddy let me around the still." So the same way with timber cutting. A lot of these families, the kids were 5 years old before their daddy let them chop down a tree. But they were experienced tree people and timber people. And we didn't have a lot of injuries, didn't have a lot of injuries on the dam.
Didn't they haul a lot of that wood out and use it?
No, they burned it.
Burn it all?
Yeah. Now, some of it is big enough for logs. They may have logged it, but so much of it was just small timber, because the big stuff we cut for wood. So why you own timberland was not to grow timber and sell it to sawmills. It was to have wood. So the bigger trees that would have made sawwood also were your best trees to split up and make firewood. And that was an ongoing job year-round, was to cut enough wood to hopefully last through the winter. None of us Some of us did, but most of us didn't. The coldest day it came, we had to be out in the woods sawing down a tree, loading it on a wagon, and then the horses balked and wouldn't pull the wagon. Tie them up and leave them in the woods all night and go down the next day and they still not moving. Had a lot of those experiences.
A lot of
Yes.
debate about global warming and stuff, and I've heard people say that 30, 40, 50 years ago, winter was a lot rougher than it's been the last 10 years or so. Of course, everybody says that. Everybody's father walked to school in the snow.
Oh no, the snow was much, much greater in the 30s and 40s than it has been in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You had the one big 93 snow, but we had lots of snows then that was 12 to 14 inches. And we'd have 10 or 15 big snows in the winter. And the temperature was not as extreme, like down to zero as often, but it was below 30 far more often than it is now. But it wasn't, we didn't have it really super extreme, but it was much, much colder. Isn't that your experience, Steve?
Yeah.
That as we grew up, it was much colder than it has been in 20 years.
It wasn't as hot in the summer. back
Oh no, even almost when 78 we moved down the fairground here, during the fair, we all wore a jacket. It was just common to wear a jacket at night in late July and August. Just as soon as the sun went down, it was chilly. It would be in the 60s. Any other question? No, I tell you how much I enjoy coming back down here. This is my home. This is the place I love most, and I could talk to you all day and all night about things that have gone on. But you're all welcome to come by the office and just visit as long as you want to. As Beverly said, first year she came to Hiawassee, I just go over and introduce myself to her. Right quick, you tell they weren't from here, you know. And we had one restaurant, and that's where we all met. And that was in the 70s, wasn't it? Yeah. And I really enjoyed talking to you. Appreciate you inviting me. But if you got any questions, come speak.
Oh, I want to say a very warm thank you so much. And